Please, don't look at my back, she begged, but the mountain man did, and burst into tears. Snow falls heavy in the Rockies. A lone trapper drags a shivering woman into his cabin, her lips blue, her eyes full of fear. By the fire, she whispers the words no man expects. Please, don't look at my back. But when he does, his world shatters. Because the scars carved into her flesh are the same kind that mark his own. The frontier is cruel, scarred by lashings, mobs, and men who thirst for vengeance. Yet in the shadows of a small town, a darker truth waits. A boy accused of theft, a mob ready to hang him, and a secret hidden in a battered Bible that could change everything. In a land where justice bends to the loudest voices, two broken souls must choose, hide in shame, or stand against the mob with nothing but faith and love to guide them. Can scars of the past become the strength to save an innocent life? Or will mercy die on the gallows at sunrise? Every time I see your comments, I'm reminded how stories connect us across distances, backgrounds, and hearts. If values like respect, courage, and compassion still guide you, then you're part of this story too. The wind howled through the snow-laden pines, their branches creaking under the weight of winter's fury. Caleb Rourke, a rugged mountain man with a face weathered by years in the wilderness, trudged down the snowy ridge. His faithful mule plodded behind him, its hooves crunching through the fresh powder. Caleb's keen ears, honed by years of survival in these unforgiving mountains, caught a sound that didn't belong. Faint cries, barely audible above the whistling wind, drifted from the direction of the frozen stream below. "Whoa there, Bessie," he murmured to his mule, patting her neck. "Reckon we ought to investigate." Carefully, Caleb picked his way down the steep slope, his eyes scanning the white landscape. As he neared the stream, a dark shape emerged from the swirling snow. His heart quickened as he realized it was a horse lying motionless in a drift. "Hello?" he called out, his gruff voice carrying on the wind. "Anyone there?" A weak moan answered him, and Caleb hurried forward. There, half buried in the snow, lay a woman. Her skin was pale as the ice around her, her lips tinged blue from the cold. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Caleb knelt beside her, brushing snow from her face. Her eyes fluttered open, revealing a gaze clouded with pain and fear. "Help, please," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. Caleb didn't hesitate. With gentle but firm hands, he scooped the woman into his arms. She was light, too light, as though the cold had stolen not just her warmth, but her very substance. "I've got you," he assured her, his voice low and steady. "My cabin's not far. We'll get you warmed up right quick." The woman didn't respond, her head lolling against his chest as he carried her. Caleb's mule followed obediently as he made his way back up the ridge, each step careful and measured despite the precious burden in his arms. The journey seemed to take an eternity, but finally the rough-hewn logs of Caleb's cabin came into view. He shouldered open the door, ducking inside the small one-room structure that had been his solitary home for so many years. Gently, he laid the woman on his narrow cot near the fireplace. Her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow. Caleb worked quickly, stoking the dying embers into a roaring blaze. The firelight danced across the cabin's sparse furnishings, a rough-hewn table, a single chair, shelves lined with provisions and trapping gear. As warmth began to fill the space, Caleb turned his attention back to his unexpected guest. He pulled a worn quilt over her still form, then set about brewing a pot of strong coffee. The familiar aroma filled the cabin, a comforting scent that seemed to rouse the woman from her stupor. Her eyes opened, darting around the unfamiliar surroundings before settling on Caleb. He approached slowly, a steaming cup in his calloused hands. "Here," he said softly, helping her sit up. "This'll help chase the chill from your bones." The woman's fingers trembled as she took the cup, but she managed a small sip. Color began to return to her cheeks, and Caleb felt a wave of relief wash over him. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice still weak but clearer now. I'm Eliza. Eliza Greyhawk." "Caleb Rourke," he replied with a nod. "You're lucky I found you when I did, Miss Greyhawk. That storm out there ain't showing signs of letting up anytime soon. Eliza's eyes widened at his words, and she glanced towards the small window. Snow pelted against the glass, driven by howling winds that made the cabin's timbers creak. I need to keep moving," she said, attempting to rise. But her legs were unsteady, and she sank back onto the cot with a grimace. Caleb shook his head. "Not in this weather, you don't. You're safe here for now. We can talk about getting you to town once the storm passes." Eliza looked ready to argue, but exhaustion seemed to win out. She nodded, taking another sip of the hot coffee. Caleb busied himself with tending the fire and preparing a simple meal of jerky and beans. As he worked, he couldn't help but notice how Eliza's gaze seemed fixed on the dancing flames, her expression a mix of weariness and something deeper, a sadness that spoke of burdens beyond the physical ordeal she'd just endured. "Your clothes are soaked through," Caleb said after a while, approaching the cot. "You'll catch your death if you don't get out of them. I've got some spare shirts that might fit you well enough until yours dry." Eliza's eyes snapped to his face, a flash of panic crossing her features. I can manage," she said quickly. "Just, please don't look at my back." Caleb's brow furrowed at her strange request, but he nodded slowly. "As you wish, Miss Greyhawk. I'll give you some privacy. Just holler if you need anything." He turned away, moving to the far side of the cabin to give Eliza space. The sound of rustling fabric filled the small room, punctuated by the occasional sharp intake of breath that hinted at hidden injuries. Caleb's mind raced with questions. What had brought this woman out into such treacherous weather? Why was she so adamant about hiding her back? He'd seen his share of scars in his time, both on battlefields and in the unforgiving wilderness. Whatever marks Eliza carried, he reckoned they weren't just skin deep. I'm decent now." Eliza's soft voice broke through his thoughts. Caleb turned to find her wrapped in his quilt, her wet clothes draped near the fire to dry. She looked small and vulnerable in the flickering light, but there was a strength in her eyes that spoke of a spirit not easily broken. "Much obliged for your kindness, Mr. Rourke," she said, her gaze meeting his for a brief moment before flitting away. "I don't mean to be a burden." Caleb shook his head, settling into the chair across from her. "No burden at all, Miss Greyhawk. These mountains can be mighty unforgiving. We look out for each other up here, even us solitary types." A ghost of a smile touched Eliza's lips, but it didn't reach her eyes. She stared into the fire once more, as though the flames held memories she couldn't bring herself to face. Caleb watched her for a long moment, weighing his words carefully. "I won't pry into your business," he said at last. "But I reckon you didn't end up half frozen by that stream on purpose. Whatever you're running from, well, you're safe here for now." Eliza's shoulders tensed at his words, but she didn't look away from the fire. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I can't stay long. I need to find someone. It's important." Caleb nodded, even though she wasn't looking at him. "Well, ain't nobody going anywhere in this storm. Come morning, if the weather's cleared, I'll help you get to town. Might be able to point you in the right direction, depending on who you're looking for." Finally, Eliza turned to face him. There were unshed tears in her eyes, but also a flicker of hope. "You'd do that? For a stranger?" "Ain't no such thing as strangers in these parts," Caleb replied with a shrug. "Just folks who haven't shared a campfire yet." A real smile, small but genuine, curved Eliza's lips. "Thank you, Mr. Rourke. Truly." Caleb felt an unfamiliar warmth in his chest at her smile. It had been a long time since he'd shared his cabin with another soul. Longer still since he'd felt the stirring of connection with another person. He pushed the feeling aside, reminding himself that come morning Eliza would be on her way. The storm raged on outside, but inside the cabin a comfortable silence settled between them. Caleb tended the fire and prepared a simple supper, while Eliza dozed fitfully on the cot. As night fell, the wind's howl became a lullaby of sorts, a reminder of the sanctuary they'd found in each other's company. Caleb knew there were questions that needed answering, mysteries surrounding the woman he'd rescued. But for now, he was content to offer what he could: warmth, safety, and the promise of help when the new day dawned. Whatever burdens Eliza Greyhawk carried, whatever secrets she held close, Caleb Rourke found himself drawn into her story, a willing ally in whatever journey lay ahead. As he settled onto his bedroll near the fire, Caleb's last thoughts before sleep claimed him were of the woman across the room. In the morning, he'd keep his promise to help her reach town. But for now, in the cocoon of warmth and safety they'd created, both Caleb and Eliza found a moment's peace in the heart of the storm. The storm's fury abated as the sun climbed higher in the sky the following afternoon. The howling winds that had rattled the cabin's timbers for hours on end finally subsided, leaving behind a world blanketed in pristine white. Caleb Rourke stood at the window, his weathered face etched with relief as he surveyed the transformed landscape. "Looks like the worst has passed," he said, turning to Eliza Greyhawk, who sat bundled in his quilt near the fire. "How are you feeling this morning?" Eliza attempted a smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Better, thank you. I should be on my way soon." Caleb shook his head, his brow furrowing with concern. "You're still weak, Miss Greyhawk. It wouldn't be right to send you out there just yet. Besides, there's work to be done before anyone should be traveling." He pulled on his heavy coat and grabbed an axe from near the door. "I need to chop some wood, make sure we've got enough to last if another storm blows in. You rest up. We can talk about getting you to town once I'm done." Eliza nodded, settling back against the wall as Caleb stepped out into the crisp winter air. The sound of his axe soon filled the clearing, a steady rhythm that spoke of strength and purpose. Inside the cabin, Eliza tried to stand, her legs wobbling beneath her. She managed a few unsteady steps before sinking back onto the cot, frustration evident in the set of her jaw. Her gaze drifted to the window, watching Caleb's tall form as he worked. There was something comforting about his presence, a steadiness that made her feel safe for the first time in longer than she cared to remember. As the afternoon wore on, Caleb returned to the cabin, his arms laden with split logs. He stacked them neatly by the hearth, stealing glances at Eliza as he worked. She seemed lost in thought, her fingers absently tracing patterns on the quilt. "Reckon we should get some food in you," Caleb said, breaking the silence. He busied himself preparing a simple stew, the familiar motions giving him time to choose his next words carefully. "Miss Greyhawk, Eliza, I know it ain't my place to pry, but I can't help but wonder what brought you out into that storm." Eliza's shoulders tensed, but she didn't look away. "I told you I'm looking for someone." Caleb nodded, stirring the pot over the fire. "Family." A long moment passed before Eliza spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "My brother, David. He's all I have left." Caleb turned, seeing the pain etched across Eliza's face. "What happened?" Eliza's hands clenched in her lap, her knuckles white. "We were in an institution, a school they called it, but—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "David couldn't take it anymore. He ran. I have to find him before—" Her voice broke, unable to finish the thought. Caleb's heart ached at the anguish in her words. He'd seen that look before, in the eyes of soldiers who'd lost everything. Without thinking, he crossed the room and knelt beside her, his rough hand covering hers. "We'll find him," he said softly. "I promise you that, Eliza. You ain't alone in this anymore." Eliza's eyes widened at his words, a flicker of hope warring with the fear and mistrust that had become her constant companions. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Caleb squeezed her hand gently before rising. "Rest now. Food'll be ready soon, and you need your strength." As evening fell, Caleb stepped outside once more to bring in another armload of firewood. The air had grown colder, and he knew they'd need to keep the fire stoked through the night. He paused at the cabin door, stamping the snow from his boots before entering. The sight that greeted him as he stepped inside stole the breath from his lungs. Eliza stood with her back to him, changing into one of his spare shirts near the fire. The flickering flames cast her skin in a golden glow, illuminating a network of scars that crisscrossed her back like a cruel tapestry. The firewood clattered to the floor as Caleb's arms went slack. Eliza whirled at the sound, her eyes wide with horror as she realized her scars were exposed. She scrambled to cover herself, but the damage was done. Caleb stood rooted to the spot, his vision blurring as memories crashed over him like a tidal wave. He saw himself, years younger, tied to a post as the lash bit into his flesh. The unjust accusations of desertion, the searing pain, the shame that had never truly faded, it all came rushing back in that moment. Before he knew what was happening, Caleb felt hot tears coursing down his cheeks. His legs gave way, and he sank to his knees, overwhelmed by the weight of shared suffering. Eliza stood frozen, one arm clutched protectively across her chest, the other reaching for him instinctively before falling back to her side. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice choked with shame and fear. You weren't supposed to see. Caleb shook his head, struggling to find his voice through the tears. No, he managed at last, looking up to meet her gaze. Don't apologize. I understand, Eliza. More than you know. With trembling hands, he unbuttoned his own shirt, turning to show her his back. Eliza's gasp was audible as she saw the familiar pattern etched into his skin. Lash marks, old but still visible, a mirror to her own scars. How? Eliza breathed, taking a hesitant step towards him. Caleb's voice was rough with emotion as he spoke. The war. They said I deserted my post. It wasn't true, but truth didn't matter much in those days. I took the lash rather than face the firing squad. He turned back to face her, seeing his own pain reflected in her eyes. I reckon we both carry more than just physical scars, don't we? Eliza nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. They said it was for our own good, to beat the savage out of us, make us civilized. But all they did was break something inside. Caleb finished softly. I know. Believe me. I know. For a long moment they stood in silence, the weight of their shared experiences hanging heavy in the air between them. Then slowly, Caleb rose to his feet. He crossed the room, stopping just short of where Eliza stood. You ain't alone anymore, he said, his voice gentle but firm. Whatever happened to you, whatever you're running from, you've got an ally now. I swear to you, Eliza Greyhawk, I'll help you find your brother, and I'll do whatever it takes to keep you both safe. Eliza searched his face, looking for any sign of deceit or pity. Finding only sincerity and a pain that matched her own, she felt something shift inside her. The walls she'd built around her heart began to crumble, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope. A small smile, fragile but genuine, curved her lips. Thank you, she whispered, reaching out to take his hand. I believe you. Caleb squeezed her fingers gently, marveling at how such a simple touch could feel like coming home after years in the wilderness. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, fraught with dangers neither of them could yet imagine. But in that moment, in the warmth of the cabin they now shared, both Caleb and Eliza felt the first stirrings of something they'd thought lost forever. The possibility of healing, of trust, of a future no longer defined by the scars they carried. As night fell outside, casting long shadows across the snow-covered landscape, two souls found solace in each other's company. The loneliness that had been their constant companion for so long began to recede, replaced by a tentative bond forged in shared pain and newfound understanding. Caleb stoked the fire, adding fresh logs to ward off the chill. Eliza settled back onto the cot, wrapping herself in the quilt that now carried the comforting scent of wood smoke and safety. They spoke little as the evening wore on, but the silence between them was no longer heavy with unspoken fears. Instead, it held the promise of stories yet to be shared, of wounds that might finally begin to heal. As Eliza drifted off to sleep, lulled by the crackling fire and the steady sound of Caleb's breathing, she felt a peace she hadn't known in years. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever obstacles stood between her and her brother, she was no longer facing them alone. And for Caleb, watching over this woman who had stumbled into his life like an answer to a prayer he'd never dared to voice, the future suddenly seemed less bleak. The scars they both carried would always be a part of them, but perhaps together, they could find a way to move beyond the pain that had defined them for so long. As the night deepened, snow began to fall once more outside the cabin windows. But inside, in the warmth of newfound trust and shared vulnerability, hope bloomed like the first fragile flowers of spring. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the storm's fury replaced by a brilliant blue sky. Caleb Rourke stirred early, his body accustomed to rising with the sun. He glanced over at Eliza Greyhawk, still sleeping soundly on the cot, her face peaceful in repose. A pang of protectiveness washed over him, surprising in its intensity. Quietly, so as not to wake her, Caleb slipped outside to tend to his mule and prepare for their journey. The air was brisk, carrying the scent of pine and melting snow. He breathed deeply, savoring the freshness that always followed a storm. As he worked, hitching the mule and checking his supplies, Caleb's mind wandered to the woman sleeping inside his cabin. The connection they'd forged the night before felt both fragile and unbreakable. He knew he couldn't simply send her on her way now. Whatever troubles pursued Eliza and her brother, Caleb was determined to see her through them. When he re-entered the cabin, Eliza was awake, folding the quilt she'd slept under. She looked up as he entered, a shy smile touching her lips. "Mornin'," Caleb said softly. "How are you feeling?" "Better," Eliza replied, her voice still rough with sleep. "Thank you. For everything." Caleb nodded, a warmth spreading through his chest at her words. "No need for thanks. Listen, I've been thinking. If you're up to it, I reckon we ought to head into town today. Get you some proper supplies, maybe see if anyone's heard word of your brother." Eliza's eyes widened slightly, a mix of hope and fear flickering across her face. You'd do that? Come with me?" "Course I would," Caleb said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Told you last night you ain't alone in this anymore." Tears welled in Eliza's eyes, but she blinked them back, nodding firmly. "I'd be grateful for the company and the help." Within the hour, they were on their way. Caleb led his mule, laden with their supplies, while Eliza walked beside him. The going was slow, their path winding through melting snowdrifts that sometimes reached knee-high, but neither minded the pace. It gave them time to talk, to share stories of their pasts in between comfortable silences. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Caleb called a halt beside a small stream. "Best we take a break," he said, helping Eliza settle on a fallen log. "I'll get a fire going, make us some coffee." Eliza watched as Caleb expertly built a small fire, his hands moving with the sureness of long practice. Soon, the rich aroma of brewing coffee filled the air, mingling with the scent of pine and damp earth. As they sipped the steaming liquid, Eliza's gaze grew distant. Caleb waited patiently, sensing she had something to say. I think David might be in this region," she said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm afraid for him, Caleb. He's so young, and he's been through so much already." Caleb nodded, understanding all too well the weight of worry for a younger sibling. "We'll find him," he promised softly. "Whatever it takes." Eliza met his eyes, gratitude shining in her own. "Thank you," she murmured. They resumed their journey, the afternoon sun warm on their backs as they made their way through the rugged landscape. Caleb found himself stealing glances at Eliza, marveling at her quiet strength. Despite all she'd endured, there was a resilience about her that touched something deep within him. As evening approached, the small frontier town of Alder Creek came into view. Lamplight spilled from the windows of the general store and saloon, casting a warm glow against the deepening twilight. Eliza tensed slightly as they entered the town proper, her eyes darting warily from face to face. Caleb laid a reassuring hand on her arm. "It's all right," he murmured. "Let's head to the general store, get what we need. Then we can see about finding a place to stay for the night." Eliza nodded, taking a deep breath to steady herself. Together, they made their way to the store, the bell above the door jingling as they entered. The shopkeeper, a portly man with a bushy mustache, looked up as they approached the counter. "Evening, folks," he said genially. "What can I do for you?" "Evening," Caleb replied. "Need some flour and lamp oil if you've got it." As the shopkeeper bustled about gathering their supplies, Eliza's attention was drawn to a conversation near the back of the store. A group of men had gathered around a stern-looking figure she guessed to be the town marshal. "Half-breed boy," she heard the marshal saying, his voice low but carrying in the quiet store. "Wanted for horse theft. We think he's hiding out in the canyons to the north." Eliza's heart leapt into her throat. She knew, with a certainty that made her dizzy, that they were talking about David. Her hands began to shake, and she gripped Caleb's sleeve tightly. Caleb, sensing her distress, quickly paid for their supplies and guided Eliza out of the store. Once outside, he led her to a quiet spot between buildings, shielding her from curious glances. "What is it?" he asked softly, his eyes searching her face. "What did you hear?" Eliza's voice trembled as she spoke. "It's David. They're looking for David. The marshal said, he said a half-breed boy is wanted for horse theft, that he's hiding in the canyons." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "Oh, Caleb, what are we going to do?" "He didn't steal anything, I know he didn't." Caleb's jaw tightened, anger flaring in his chest at the casual use of such a cruel term. But he pushed it aside, focusing on the fear in Eliza's eyes. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and intense. "We're going to find him. We'll get to him before that posse does, I swear it." He took her hands in his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "I won't let anything happen to your brother, Eliza. You have my word." Eliza searched his face, finding only sincerity and determination in his eyes. She nodded, taking a shaky breath. "Thank you," she whispered, a spark of hope kindling in her heart. "I don't know what I'd do without you, Caleb." For a moment they stood there in the gathering darkness, hands clasped, the weight of their shared purpose settling between them. Then Caleb straightened, his expression resolute. "Come on," he said softly. "Let's find a place to stay for the night. We'll need to start early tomorrow if we're going to beat that posse to the canyons." As they made their way down the town's main street, seeking out the small boarding house they'd spotted earlier, Eliza felt a curious mix of fear and hope swirling in her chest. The road ahead was fraught with danger, but for the first time in longer than she could remember, she didn't feel alone. She glanced at Caleb, walking steadily beside her, and sent up a silent prayer of thanks for the twist of fate that had brought this man into her life. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever obstacles stood between her and David, Eliza knew that with Caleb by her side they stood a fighting chance. The lamps of Alder Creek cast long shadows as night settled over the town, but in the hearts of Caleb and Eliza, a flame of determination burned bright, illuminating the path that would lead them into the canyons and, they hoped, to David. The first light of dawn painted the sky in soft hues of pink and gold as Caleb and Eliza prepared for their journey. The small town of Alder Creek stirred slowly to life around them, but their focus remained on the task at hand. Caleb, his face set with determination, carefully sorted through their supplies. "We'll need to travel light," he said, his voice low and gruff. "Can't risk slowing ourselves down." Eliza nodded, her eyes shadowed with worry but her movements sure as she helped pack. Caleb laid out their essentials: 2 rifles, gleaming dully in the early morning light, several strips of dried jerky, tough but nourishing, and a pair of thick woolen blankets to ward off the night's chill. As Eliza reached for her scarf, her fingers trembled slightly. She paused, closing her eyes for a moment, her lips moving in silent prayer. "Please," she whispered, so softly Caleb almost missed it. "Keep David safe." Caleb watched her, a lump forming in his throat. He'd seen that look before, in the eyes of mothers and sisters during the war, praying for their loved one's safe return. Gently, he placed a hand on her shoulder. "We'll find him," he promised, his voice rough with emotion. Eliza opened her eyes, meeting Caleb's gaze. She managed a small smile, drawing strength from his steady presence. With renewed purpose, she tied her scarf tighter, ready to face whatever lay ahead. The sun had barely cleared the horizon when they set out, leaving Alder Creek behind. Caleb led the way on his sturdy mount, with Eliza following close behind. Their horses' hooves kicked up small clouds of dust as they wound their way along dry creek beds, the sound of rushing water a distant memory in the parched landscape. As the morning wore on, The terrain grew more rugged. Rocky outcroppings jutted from the earth like ancient bones, casting long shadows across their path. Caleb kept a watchful eye on their surroundings, alert for any sign of David, or the posse that hunted him. By midday, the sun beat down mercilessly from above. Caleb called a halt near a stand of scraggly juniper trees, offering what little shade could be found. As they shared a meager meal of jerky and water, Eliza's gaze was drawn to a distant hilltop. "I know this place," she said softly, her voice tinged with sadness. Caleb followed her line of sight, squinting against the harsh light. There, silhouetted against the sky, stood the blackened remains of a homestead. "I worked there once," Eliza continued, her eyes never leaving the burned-out structure. "The family was kind. Her voice caught, and she swallowed hard before continuing. "They tried to hide me when the men from the institution came, but it wasn't enough." Caleb listened in silence, his jaw clenched tight. The injustice of it all burned in his chest, stoking the embers of anger he'd carried for so long. He thought of the scars on Eliza's back, of the fear in her eyes when she spoke of the place that should have protected her. His hands curled into fists at his sides. Eliza seemed to sense his turmoil. She turned to him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "It's in the past now," she said gently. "We can't change what happened. But maybe we can make a better future." Her words, spoken with such quiet hope, pierced through Caleb's anger. He nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. After a moment, he managed a gruff, "We'd best get moving." They rode on, the burned homestead fading into the distance behind them. As the afternoon waned, the landscape grew wilder still. Narrow canyons carved deep furrows into the earth, their walls rising high on either side. Caleb led them carefully along the winding paths, always alert for signs of recent passage. By the time the sun began to sink toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the land, both riders and horses were weary. Caleb found a small clearing, nestled between towering rock formations, sheltered from the wind and hidden from prying eyes. "We'll make camp here for the night," he announced, dismounting with a grunt. Eliza slid from her saddle, her muscles stiff from the long day's ride. As Caleb tended to the horses, Eliza gathered what kindling she could find. Soon, a small fire crackled cheerfully in the gathering dusk. Caleb set about preparing a simple stew, the familiar routine of camp life coming back to him easily. The night deepened around them, stars appearing one by one in the vast expanse of sky above. As Caleb stirred the bubbling pot, a soft sound caught his attention. Eliza, seated cross-legged by the fire, had begun to hum. The melody was unfamiliar to him, haunting and beautiful in its simplicity. "What's that?" he asked quietly, not wanting to break the spell her voice had cast. Eliza's humming faded, but a small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "It's a Cherokee hymn," she explained. "My father taught it to me when I was very young. It's a prayer for guidance and protection." Caleb nodded, feeling something stir deep within him. It had been a long time since he'd given much thought to matters of faith. The war had shaken his beliefs, leaving him bitter and doubting. But there was something in Eliza's voice, in the quiet strength of her conviction, that touched a part of him he'd thought long dead. As they shared the simple meal, Eliza's song seemed to linger in the air around them. Caleb found himself studying her in the flickering firelight, noticing the way her eyes reflected the dancing flames, the gentle curve of her cheek. A warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the stew or the fire. They talked long into the night, sharing stories of their pasts and hopes for the future. Eliza spoke of her brother, of the bond they shared, despite the hardships they'd faced. Caleb, usually so guarded, found himself opening up about his own family, about the guilt he carried for leaving his younger brother behind. As the fire burned low, a comfortable silence fell between them. Eliza reached out, her hand finding Caleb's in the darkness. He stiffened for a moment, then relaxed, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. "Thank you," Eliza whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling embers. "For everything." Caleb squeezed her hand gently, words failing him. In that moment, under the vast canopy of stars, something shifted between them. A spark of affection, of possibility, lingered in the air. As they settled into their bedrolls, Caleb found himself filled with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever dangers they might face in their search for David, he knew he would face them with Eliza by his side, and for the first time in a long time, he felt the stirrings of hope in his heart. The morning sun had barely crested the canyon walls when Caleb spotted it, a thin wisp of smoke rising against the cloudless sky. He raised a hand, signaling Eliza to halt. Their horses stamped restlessly, sensing the tension in their riders. "There," Caleb whispered, pointing toward a rocky overhang in the distance. "Might be your brother." Eliza's heart leapt into her throat. She nodded, unable to speak past the sudden tightness in her chest. They had been searching for 2 long days, picking their way through narrow canyons and treacherous ravines. Now finally a sign of life. Caleb dismounted with practiced ease, his boots barely making a sound as they hit the dusty ground. He held out a hand to help Eliza down, steadying her as she stumbled slightly. The long days in the saddle had taken their toll on both of them. "We approach slow and quiet," Caleb murmured, his eyes never leaving the distant smoke. "Don't want to spook him if it is David." Eliza nodded again, swallowing hard. She followed Caleb's lead, crouching low as they made their way forward. The rough terrain made for slow going, loose stones threatening to give way beneath their feet with each step. As they drew closer to the overhang, a flicker of movement caught Caleb's eye. He threw out an arm, stopping Eliza in her tracks. Before he could utter a warning, a figure burst from the shadows, brandishing a thick stick like a club. "Stay back," a young voice cracked with fear and desperation. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. Even gaunt and wild-eyed, she would know that face anywhere. "David!" she cried, surging forward past Caleb's outstretched arm. For a moment, David stood frozen, the stick still raised above his head. Then recognition dawned in his eyes, and the makeshift weapon clattered to the ground. "Eliza?" he whispered, disbelief etched across his features. In an instant, the siblings collided, arms wrapping tightly around each other. They sank to their knees, overcome by emotion. Eliza's shoulders shook with silent sobs as she cradled her brother's head against her chest. David clung to her like a drowning man to a lifeline, his own tears leaving dusty tracks down his cheeks. Caleb hung back, giving them space. His own throat felt tight as he watched the reunion, memories of his own brother rising unbidden to the surface. He pushed them aside, focusing instead on keeping watch. They weren't out of danger yet. After what felt like an eternity, Eliza pulled back slightly, cupping David's face in her hands. "Are you hurt?" she asked, her voice rough with emotion. "We heard. They said you stole horses." David's face clouded, a mix of anger and fear flashing in his eyes. "I didn't steal nothing," he insisted. "Old man Johnson, he was dying. Said I reminded him of his own boy, lost in the war." David's words tumbled out in a rush as though he'd been holding them in for too long. "He gave me his herd, said I'd earned it working for him, even wrote it all down proper so no one could say different." Caleb stepped closer, his brow furrowed. "Then how'd you end up accused of thieving?" he asked gruffly. David's shoulders slumped. "Johnson's nephew," he spat the word like a curse. "Soon as the old man passed, he shows up claiming everything. Tore up the letter right in front of me, said no one would believe a half-breed over kin." He looked up at Eliza, his eyes pleading. "I swear I didn't steal nothing. But who's gonna believe me now?" A low growl rumbled in Caleb's chest, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. The injustice of it all burned in his gut, stoking the embers of an anger he thought long buried. He'd seen too much of this during the war. Good men brought low by the greed and prejudice of others. Eliza pulled David close again, running a soothing hand over his matted hair. "We believe you," she murmured fiercely, "and we're going to make this right. I promise." She looked up at Caleb, a silent question in her eyes. He nodded once, decision made. "We ride for town," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Clear your name proper, with the law and whoever else needs convincing." David stiffened, fear evident in every line of his body. But what if they don't listen? What if they just lock me up? Caleb crouched down, meeting the boy's gaze steadily. "Then we keep fightin'," he said simply. "Ain't gonna let an innocent man suffer for another's greed. You got my word on that?" Something in Caleb's tone seemed to reach David. He straightened slightly, a flicker of hope kindling in his eyes. Eliza squeezed his hand, lending her own strength. "Together," she said softly, "we face this together." As they made their way back to the horses, Caleb couldn't help but feel the weight of what lay ahead. They were riding into the teeth of prejudice and corruption, armed with nothing but the truth and their own determination. But looking at Eliza and David, reunited against all odds, he knew it was a fight worth having. With the sun climbing higher in the sky, they mounted up, Eliza and David sharing a horse, unwilling to be separated even for a moment. As they set out toward town, Caleb felt a fierce protectiveness settle over him. These two had suffered enough. Whatever came next, he'd see them through it. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Their small band had just become a family. And family, Caleb was beginning to remember, was worth fighting for. The sun hung low in the sky as Caleb, Eliza, and David made their way along the winding trail back to Alder Creek. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and distant snow-capped peaks. Caleb rode point, his keen eyes scanning the path ahead, while Eliza and David shared a horse behind him. As they traveled, Caleb noticed David eyeing his rifle with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. He slowed his mount, falling in beside the siblings. "Ever handled a firearm before, boy?" Caleb asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. David shook his head, his eyes wide. "No, sir. Pa never got the chance to teach me before." His voice trailed off, the loss still raw. Caleb nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Well, reckon it's time you learned. Might come in handy." Eliza tensed behind her brother. "Is that really necessary?" she asked, worry evident in her tone. "We're trying to clear his name, not start more trouble." Caleb met her gaze steadily. "Sometimes knowing how to defend yourself is what keeps trouble at bay," he said softly. "But I hear your concern. We'll start with safety first." Over the next few hours as they rode, Caleb explained the basics of firearm safety to David. He emphasized the importance of treating every gun as if it were loaded, never pointing it at anything you didn't intend to shoot, and always being aware of what lay beyond your target. David listened intently, soaking up every word. By the time they stopped to make camp near a burbling creek, the boy's earlier fear of Caleb had begun to fade, replaced by a cautious respect. As the evening deepened, Eliza tended to a small fire while Caleb showed David how to properly clean and care for a rifle. The firelight cast long shadows across their faces, softening the hard lines etched by years of struggle. Once the chores were done and a simple meal of jerky and hardtack consumed, a contemplative silence fell over the camp. Caleb stared into the flames, his thoughts seeming to drift far away. Finally he spoke, his voice low and rough with memory. "Reckon it's time I told you both why I understand them scars you carry, Eliza." Eliza and David leaned in, sensing the weight of what was to come. Caleb took a deep breath, then began his tale. He spoke of the war, of the horror and senselessness he'd witnessed. He described a hopeless skirmish, outnumbered and outgunned, where he'd made the agonizing choice to flee rather than die needlessly. "I deserted," he admitted, shame coloring his words. "Left my own brother behind. By the time I came to my senses and tried to go back, it was too late." His voice grew bitter as he recounted what came next, being caught by his own officers, branded a coward, and sentenced to lashing. 20 strokes, he said, his hand unconsciously moving to his back. Each one felt like it was tearing my soul apart, not just my flesh. Eliza listened with growing compassion, her own eyes glistening with unshed tears. When Caleb fell silent, she reached out, gently touching his arm. "You were not a coward," she said softly but firmly. "You were a man broken by cruelty, just as I was. There's no shame in that." Caleb looked up, meeting her gaze. For a moment, the hardness in his eyes softened, a flicker of hope kindling where before there had been only guilt. As the fire burned low and they prepared for sleep, David whispered to Eliza, his voice tinged with lingering uncertainty. "I know he saved your life, but he still scares me sometimes. He's so rough." Eliza stroked her brother's hair, her voice gentle but firm. "Caleb may be rough on the outside, but he has a good heart. Remember, he risked everything to help us when he could have just left me in the snow. Judge him by his actions, not his scars." David nodded slowly, mulling over her words as sleep claimed him. The next morning dawned cold and clear. Frost glittered on the grass, crunching under their boots as they broke camp. As they mounted up to continue their journey, a new resolve seemed to settle over the group. Caleb led the way, his posture straight and determined. Eliza and David followed close behind, drawing strength from each other and the man who had become their unexpected protector. The town of Alder Creek lay ahead, bringing with it the promise of justice, or further struggle. But whatever challenges awaited them, they would face them together. 3 wounded souls united by compassion and a shared hope for redemption. The sun hung high in the sky as Caleb, Eliza, and David approached the outskirts of Alder Creek. The town's wooden buildings came into view, their weathered facades a stark contrast to the wild beauty of the surrounding mountains. As they rode down the main street, the clip-clop of hooves on packed dirt drew curious glances from townsfolk going about their daily business. Whispers rippled through the streets like a breeze through tall grass. Eyes narrowed and fingers pointed discreetly at David. The boy hunched his shoulders, feeling the weight of suspicion bearing down on him. "Hold your head high," Eliza murmured, squeezing her brother's arm. "We know the truth." Caleb's jaw tightened as he observed the growing tension. He guided their small party towards the marshal's office, a squat building with a wooden star nailed above the door. "Wait here," he told Eliza and David, his voice gruff but tinged with concern. "I'll speak to the marshal first." Inside the office, Caleb found Marshal Thompson, a weather-beaten man with steely eyes. The trapper's presence filled the small room as he planted his hands on the desk. "I've brought in David Greyhawk," Caleb stated firmly. "The boy accused of horse theft." The marshal's eyebrows shot up. "Well now, didn't expect him to come willingly." "Because he's innocent," Caleb growled. "He deserves a fair hearing, not a lynch mob." Outside, Eliza's heart raced as she watched more townspeople gather, their muttering growing louder. She spotted a man in a black coat and white collar, clearly the local preacher, and made a split-second decision. "David, stay with the horses," she said. "I'll be right back." Eliza approached the preacher, her steps quick but hesitant. "Reverend?" she called softly. The man turned, revealing a kind face etched with lines of both laughter and concern. "Yes, my child?" "I'm Eliza Greyhawk. That boy there," she nodded towards David, "is my brother. He's been falsely accused, and I fear the town won't give him a chance to prove his innocence." The preacher's eyes softened with compassion. "I'm Reverend Josiah Carter," he said. "New to this parish, but I've already seen how quick folks can be to judge." He paused, studying Eliza's face. "Tell me more." As Eliza explained David's situation, Reverend Carter listened intently. When she finished, he nodded solemnly. "I'll speak to the marshal," he promised, "and to the people. We must let justice and mercy walk hand in hand." Inside the jail, David sat on a hard wooden bench, his eyes darting nervously around the cell. Caleb stood nearby, his presence a silent comfort. The door opened, admitting Eliza, Reverend Carter, and Marshal Thompson. The marshal's face was grim as he addressed David. "Son, you're in a heap of trouble," he said, "but Reverend Carter here has convinced me to give you a proper hearing tomorrow morning." Hope flickered in David's eyes. Eliza rushed to embrace her brother, whispering words of encouragement. Reverend Carter cleared his throat. "I'll address the townsfolk," he said. "Urge them to be patient, to let the evidence be heard before passing judgment." As the preacher left, Caleb turned to the marshal. "I need to see to my mule," he said gruffly. "You'll keep the boy safe?" Marshal Thompson nodded. "No one's getting to him without going through me first." Outside, the crowd had grown, their voices a low, angry rumble. Reverend Carter stood on the jailhouse steps, his arms raised for silence. Good people of Alder Creek, he began, his voice carrying across the street. I know you're angry. I know you want justice. But true justice requires patience and wisdom. Some in the crowd muttered agreement while others scowled. The Reverend continued, quoting scripture and appealing to their better natures. Slowly, the tension began to ease. As dusk painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, Eliza sat with David in his cell. She held his hand, her voice low and soothing. Trust in the law, David, she said. Reverend Carter and Marshal Thompson will make sure you get a fair hearing. And Caleb, he may be rough, but he's on our side. David nodded, though fear still lurked in his eyes. What if they don't believe me? He whispered. Then we'll find a way, Eliza promised. We're family, we stick together. Outside the jail, however, not everyone had been swayed by the Reverend's words. As night fell, a group of men gathered in the shadows behind the saloon. Their voices were low, but their intent was clear. We can't let some half-breed thief get away with it, one man growled. Law or no law, he needs to pay. Agreement rumbled through the small crowd. As they dispersed, a sense of foreboding settled over Alder Creek like a heavy blanket. Inside the jail, unaware of the simmering threat, David closed his eyes and tried to sleep. Eliza kept vigil nearby, her hand never leaving her brother's. And outside, Caleb leaned against a hitching post, his keen eyes watching the darkened streets, ready to face whatever the night might bring. The night settled over Alder Creek like a heavy blanket, muffling the day's commotion but not the simmering tension. Lamplight spilled from the windows of Reverend Carter's modest parsonage, casting long shadows across the worn floorboards inside. In this flickering glow, Caleb Rourke's weathered face looked even more careworn, his eyes dark with worry as he paced the small room. Eliza Greyhawk stood near the window, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as if to hold in her fears. The Reverend sat at his simple desk, fingers steepled, watching the two with a mixture of concern and resignation. We can't just sit here and wait for them to string David up. Caleb's voice was low but fierce, his words clipped with frustration. I've seen mobs like this before. They don't care about justice, they want blood. Eliza whirled to face him, her eyes flashing. And running away proves what? That David's guilty? That we don't trust the law? Her voice quavered, but her chin lifted defiantly. I won't let them brand my brother a thief and a coward. Caleb's fists clenched at his sides. Better alive and called a coward than swinging from a tree. He took a deep breath, trying to soften his tone. Eliza, please. I can get us out of town before anyone's the wiser. We can start fresh somewhere else. No. Eliza's voice was quiet but firm. David deserves justice, not a life on the run. We stay. Reverend Carter cleared his throat, drawing their attention. I understand both your positions, he said carefully. Caleb, your instinct to protect is admirable, and Eliza, your faith in justice is inspiring. He paused, weighing his words. But we must consider the consequences of either choice. The preacher stood, moving to stand between them. If you flee now, it's true. David will be seen as guilty in the eyes of the town. The accusation will follow you, making it hard to settle anywhere. He turned to Caleb. But Caleb is right to be concerned. The mood out there is ugly. Staying puts David's life at risk. Eliza's shoulders sagged, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. What would you have us do, Reverend? Carter sighed heavily. I cannot make this choice for you, but I will stand by whatever decision you make and do all in my power to help. Outside, the night air carried the acrid smell of smoke and the low murmur of angry voices. Near the saloon, a group of men huddled around a figure who gestured animatedly, his words punctuated by the sloshing of a whiskey bottle. I'm telling you, the man slurred, his eyes glinting with malice, that half-breed ain't just a horse thief. He's dangerous. A few of the men nodded, emboldened by alcohol and the safety of numbers. The speaker was none other than the rancher's nephew, the very man who had framed David. His lies flowed as freely as the whiskey he passed around. My poor uncle, he continued, voice dripping with false sentiment, trusted that boy, and look how he repaid that kindness. The crowd grew, feeding on the nephew's words and the shared anger that pulsed through the night air. Torches were lit, casting eerie shadows that danced on the weathered buildings of Alder Creek. Back at the jail, Eliza stood before the cell that held her brother. David's face was pale in the dim light, his eyes wide with fear he tried desperately to hide. Eliza reached through the bars, clasping his hands tightly in hers. "Don't be afraid," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the distant shouting outside. "God is with us, David. He won't abandon us now." David nodded, but his grip on Eliza's hands tightened. "I hear them out there, Eliza," he said softly. "They sound ready to tear this place apart." Eliza closed her eyes, her lips moving in silent prayer. The faith that had sustained her through years of hardship now seemed both a lifeline and a burden. How could she reconcile her belief in justice with the very real danger facing her beloved brother? Caleb stood a few paces away, his back to the cell as he peered out the small window. The flickering torches in the distance made his jaw clench. Every instinct screamed at him to grab David and Eliza, to flee into the night and leave this powder keg of a town far behind. But as he watched Eliza whispering words of comfort to her brother, saw the strength in her slender frame and the unwavering trust in her eyes, Caleb felt something shift inside him. It had been so long since he'd believed in anything beyond his own survival. Eliza's faith, as foreign to him as it was, stirred something long dormant in his heart. The crowd outside grew louder, their angry voices carried on the wind. The torches drew closer like fireflies heralding a storm. Caleb's hand instinctively went to his hip, where his pistol hung heavy with promise and threat. Reverend Carter entered the jail, his face grave. "They're coming," he said simply. "We don't have much time." Eliza straightened, her eyes meeting Caleb's. In that moment, a silent understanding passed between them. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The night air crackled with tension, thick enough to choke on. The mob's torches flickered in the wind, casting long, distorted shadows across the dusty streets of Alder Creek. The angry voices grew louder, a tide of righteous fury sweeping towards the jail. Inside, David pressed himself against the back of his cell, his eyes wide with fear. Eliza stood firm before the bars, her hand still clasping her brother's, while Caleb positioned himself protectively in front of them both. Reverend Carter stood near the door, his Bible clutched tightly to his chest, praying for wisdom and mercy. As the first shouts of "Bring out the thief" reached their ears, the small group inside the jail exchanged glances. The night stretched before them, long and fraught with danger. David's life hung in the balance, and with it the very soul of Alder Creek. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, painting the sky in soft hues of pink and gold. But the beauty of the new day was lost on the angry mob that surged through the streets of Alder Creek. Their shouts shattered the early morning stillness, a cacophony of fury and vengeance that echoed off weathered buildings. At the jail, the door splintered under the force of dozens of fists. Men poured in, their faces twisted with rage. Reverend Carter stood before them, arms outstretched, his Bible held high like a shield. "Please," he pleaded, his voice hoarse with desperation. "This isn't justice. We must give the boy a fair trial." But his words fell on deaf ears. The mob pushed past him, rough hands reaching for David Greyhawk. The young man's eyes were wide with terror as he was dragged from his cell, his feet scrabbling against the wooden floor. "No!" Eliza screamed, lunging forward. She clung to her brother, her fingers digging into his shirt. "You can't take him! He's innocent!" Two men pried her away, their grips bruising on her arms. Eliza fought like a wildcat, kicking and clawing, but she was no match for their strength. Tears streamed down her face as she watched David being pulled towards the door. Caleb Rourke burst through the crowd, his face a mask of determination. He had promised to protect them, and he wouldn't fail now. His fist connected with the jaw of the man holding David, sending him staggering back. But before Caleb could press his advantage, something hard and unyielding struck him from behind. The butt of a rifle slammed into his skull, sending him sprawling to the dusty floor. Stars exploded in his vision as boots connected with his ribs again and again. Through the haze of pain, Caleb heard Eliza's anguished cries. He tried to rise, to fight back, but his limbs wouldn't obey. The world spun around him as rough hands seized his arms, dragging him out onto the boardwalk. The town marshal pushed through the crowd, his face pale and drawn. "Stand down," he shouted, but his voice was lost in the roar of the mob. He was just one man, overwhelmed by the tide of anger that had swept through Alder Creek. David was hauled to the center of the street where a wagon stood waiting. Strong hands lashed him to the tongue, the ropes biting into his wrists. He didn't struggle, his eyes fixed on Eliza with a mixture of fear and resigned acceptance. "Sunrise!" someone shouted. "We'll string him up at sunrise." A cheer went up from the crowd, a sound that chilled Eliza to her very soul. She stumbled towards her brother, only to be held back by the preacher's gentle but firm grip. "Child," Reverend Carter murmured, his voice thick with sorrow, "you'll only get yourself hurt." Eliza sagged against him, her strength finally giving out. Her eyes searched the crowd, finding Caleb's crumpled form on the boardwalk. She broke free from the preacher's grasp and rushed to his side, cradling his bloodied head in her lap. "Caleb," she whispered, her tears falling onto his battered face. "Oh, Caleb, please be all right." His eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glazed with pain. "Eliza," he rasped, trying to sit up. "The boy." "Shh," she soothed, gently restraining him. "Don't move. You're hurt bad." Eliza's heart felt like it was being torn in two. Her brother bound and awaiting execution. Caleb, beaten and broken on the boardwalk. It was all too familiar, a cruel echo of the past she had tried so hard to escape. She lifted her face to the lightening sky, her voice a broken whisper. "Please, God," she prayed, "don't let it happen again. You took my father. You let them hurt me. Don't take David too. Please don't let history repeat itself." Caleb's hand found hers, squeezing weakly. "I won't," he mumbled, his words slurred but determined. "Won't let the boy die." Eliza looked down at him, seeing the resolve burning in his eyes despite the pain. She knew then that Caleb would fight for David until his last breath, just as she would. In that moment, a spark of hope flickered in her chest, fragile but persistent. The mob began to disperse, confident in their victory. They left David tied to the wagon, two armed men standing guard nearby. The rest of the town slowly came to life, doors opening as curious and fearful faces peered out at the scene of violence that had unfolded in their streets. Reverend Carter knelt beside Eliza and Caleb, his weathered hands gentle as he examined Caleb's injuries. "We need to get him inside," he said softly. "Can you help me, child?" Together they managed to half carry, half drag Caleb into the preacher's small home next to the church. They laid him on a narrow bed, where he groaned and tried once more to rise. "David," he muttered, his eyes wild. "Gotta save David." Eliza pressed a cool cloth to his forehead, her heart aching at his determination. "Rest now," she whispered. "We'll find a way. Somehow, we'll save him." But as she spoke the words, Eliza wondered how they could possibly stop what seemed inevitable. The sun was climbing higher, each passing minute bringing them closer to the moment when her brother would face the hangman's noose. She moved to the window, watching as the first golden rays touched the tops of the buildings. In the street, she could see David, his head bowed but his back straight. Even now, facing death, he showed a quiet dignity that made her chest swell with pride and sorrow. Eliza's hands clenched at her sides, her nails digging into her palms. She had survived so much: the loss of her parents, the cruelty of the orphanage, the scars that marked her body and soul. She had found Caleb, a man who understood her pain and offered her hope. Now, with David's life hanging in the balance, she knew she couldn't give up. Turning back to Caleb's bedside, Eliza saw his eyes flutter open, clearer now but filled with a pain that went beyond his physical injuries. She knelt beside him, taking his rough hand in hers. "We don't have much time," she said, her voice low and urgent. "Caleb, what can we do? How can we save my brother?" As night settled over Alder Creek, a heavy silence blanketed the town. The angry shouts of the mob had faded, replaced by an uneasy quiet that seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the dawn. Inside the small parsonage, lamplight flickered through the windows, casting long shadows across the worn floorboards. Eliza Greyhawk sat beside Caleb Rourke's bed, her gentle hands tending to his wounds. The bruises on his face had darkened, a painful testament to the beating he'd endured. She dabbed a damp cloth against his split lip, her touch as soft as a whisper. "You don't have to fuss over me," Caleb mumbled, his voice rough with pain. "I've had worse." Eliza shook her head, her eyes never leaving her task. "Hush now, let me do this for you." As she worked, Caleb watched her face in the lamplight, the worry etched in her brow, the determined set of her jaw. It stirred something deep within him. He'd known loneliness for so long, but in her presence that ache began to fade. "Eliza," he said softly, catching her wrist as she reached to re-wet the cloth. "There's something I need to tell you." She paused, sensing the weight in his words. "What is it, Caleb?" He took a shuddering breath, his eyes closing against a pain that went far beyond his physical injuries. "I told you before that I deserted during the war. But that's not the whole truth." Eliza set aside the cloth, giving him her full attention. She could see the struggle in his face, the way his jaw clenched against words that seemed to pain him. "I had a brother," Caleb continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Younger than me. We enlisted together, swore we'd look out for each other." He swallowed hard, fighting against the lump in his throat. "But when the shells started falling, when men were dying all around us, I ran." Tears began to spill from beneath his closed eyelids, tracing paths down his weathered cheeks. "I left him there, Eliza, my own flesh and blood, and I abandoned him on that battlefield." Eliza's heart clenched at the raw anguish in his voice. She reached out, laying her hand against his cheek, her thumb gently brushing away his tears. "He never came back," Caleb choked out. "I waited, prayed, but he was gone. Because of me." The weight of his confession hung heavy in the air between them. Eliza could feel the tremors running through his body, years of guilt and shame finally finding voice. "Oh, Caleb," she whispered, her own eyes brimming with tears. "I'm so sorry." He opened his eyes then, meeting her gaze. The pain she saw there was almost unbearable. "That's why I have to save David," he said, his voice growing stronger. "It feels like God's giving me a second chance, a chance to make things right." Eliza's hand moved to clasp his, squeezing gently. "Mercy is always possible," she murmured, "even when we can't see it." For a long moment they sat in silence, their joined hands a bridge across their shared pain. Eliza felt something shift within her, a deepening of the affection she'd begun to feel for this broken, brave man. It was more than gratitude, more than friendship. With a start, she realized it was love, a fragile, newborn thing, but undeniable. Yet even as her heart swelled with this revelation, fear clouded her hope. Dawn was approaching, bringing with it the threat of violence and loss. How could love flourish in the shadow of such darkness? In the small church next door, Reverend Josiah Carter knelt before the altar, his head bowed in fervent prayer. The weight of responsibility pressed down upon him, threatening to crush his spirit. How could he face the mob at sunrise? What words could possibly turn aside their thirst for vengeance? "Lord," he whispered, his voice trembling, "give me strength. Show me the path to justice and mercy. Help me to be your voice in this darkness." But even as he prayed, doubt gnawed at him. He was just one man, armed only with faith and words. Would it be enough to save a young life and heal a town torn apart by anger? Back in the parsonage, Eliza found herself drawn into Caleb's embrace. She rested her head against his chest, careful of his injuries, listening to the steady beat of his heart. His arms encircled her, strong despite his weakness, offering comfort even as he sought it. "We'll find a way," Caleb murmured into her hair. "Somehow we'll save David." Eliza clung to him, drawing strength from his determination. She wanted to believe him, to trust that love and justice could triumph over hatred and fear. But the night was deep, and morning approached with terrifying speed. As they held each other, both Caleb and Eliza felt the weight of the coming dawn. Their newfound love, tender and uncertain, faced its first and greatest test. Could it withstand the storm that was brewing outside? Could their bond, forged in shared pain and hope, be strong enough to save not just David, but themselves as well? The lamplight flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. In the distance, a coyote's lonely howl echoed through the night, a mournful sound that seemed to give voice to the fear and longing that filled the small room. Eliza shivered, pressing closer to Caleb's warmth. Together they waited for the morning, clinging to each other and to the fragile hope that burned between them. The night deepened around them, but in their shared embrace, they found a light that even the darkest dawn could not extinguish. As the first pale light of dawn crept over the eastern horizon, a chill wind swept through the streets of Alder Creek. The town stirred to life, but not with the usual sounds of roosters crowing or shopkeepers opening their doors. Instead, a low murmur grew steadily louder as men and women gathered near the edge of town, their faces grim and determined. The makeshift gallows stood like a dark silhouette against the lightening sky. Its rough-hewn beams creaked in the wind, a sound that sent shivers down the spines of even the most hardened onlookers. The crowd pressed closer, their breath visible in the cold morning air as they waited with a mix of anticipation and dread. From the direction of the jail came the sound of heavy footsteps and rattling chains. The mob parted, revealing a small procession making its way towards the gallows. At its center walked David Greyhawk, his hands bound tightly behind his back. The young man's face was pale, but he held his head high, his eyes scanning the crowd as if searching for a friendly face. Two deputies flanked David, their hands resting uneasily on their gun belts. Behind them came the marshal, his expression torn between duty and doubt. As they neared the gallows, a hush fell over the crowd, broken only by the occasional muttered curse or whispered prayer. Suddenly, a commotion erupted from the edge of the gathering. Caleb Rourke pushed his way through the throng, his face still bruised and swollen from the beating he had taken the day before. He staggered forward, his legs unsteady but his voice strong as he called out, "Wait! You can't do this!" Caleb's eyes were wild with desperation as he scanned the faces around him. "Where's the preacher?" he demanded. "Reverend Carter needs to be heard. This boy deserves a fair hearing." But his pleas fell on deaf ears. Several men stepped forward, roughly shoving Caleb aside. He stumbled, nearly falling, but managed to keep his feet. "You're making a mistake," he shouted, his voice hoarse with emotion. "David's innocent." From somewhere in the crowd came Eliza's anguished cry. She pushed her way to the front, her hair disheveled and her eyes red from a sleepless night of tears and prayer. As she caught sight of her brother being led to the gallows, Eliza's strength seemed to desert her. She fell to her knees in the dirt, her hands clasped before her in supplication. "Please," she begged, her voice breaking. "I'm begging you all, don't do this. We don't need vengeance, we need justice." Her words seemed to give some in the crowd pause. A few faces softened, uncertainty replacing anger in their eyes. But before that spark of doubt could spread, a harsh laugh cut through the morning air. The rancher's nephew stepped forward, a cruel smile twisting his features. "Justice?" he sneered. "That's exactly what we're here for, miss. Your brother's a thief and a liar, and he's going to pay for his crimes." With a flourish, the nephew produced several men from the crowd. "These good folks saw your brother stealing horses with their own eyes," he declared. "Ain't that right, boys?" The men nodded, though a few couldn't quite meet the eyes of those around them. Their rehearsed statements rang hollow in the crisp morning air, but the mob was hungry for resolution, eager to believe the simplest explanation. Caleb, who had managed to push his way back to the front, shouted over the growing murmur of the crowd. "Lies!" he roared, his face flushed with anger. "Every word of it. That boy was given those horses fair and square." But his words were drowned out by the swelling noise of the mob. The hunger for blood that had simmered overnight now boiled over, reason and mercy evaporating in its heat. Shouts for immediate justice filled the air, drowning out the pleas of those few who still called for restraint. At a signal from the marshal, who seemed to have given up any pretense of maintaining order, the deputies marched David up the rickety steps of the gallows. The young man's composure finally cracked, fear flashing in his eyes as he looked desperately towards his sister. "Eliza!" he called out, his voice cracking. "Eliza, I'm sorry!" Eliza struggled to her feet, fighting against the hands that held her back. David! She screamed, reaching out as if she could bridge the distance between them through sheer force of will. The executioner, a grim-faced man who had volunteered for the task, stepped forward with the noose in his hands. The rope creaked as he threw it over the beam, the sound carrying clearly over the now hushed crowd. With practiced movements, he adjusted the knot, pulling it tight. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. Eliza watched in horror as the rough hemp was lowered over her brother's head, coming to rest around his neck. David closed his eyes, his lips moving in what might have been a prayer. The crowd pressed closer, their collective breath held in anticipation. Some looked eager, others uncertain, but all were transfixed by the grim spectacle before them. The marshal raised his hand, preparing to give the signal that would end a young man's life and forever change the soul of their small town. In that frozen moment, as hope seemed lost and darkness poised to triumph, Eliza found her voice once more. With all the strength left in her body, she cried out to the heavens, her voice echoing off the buildings and cutting through the tension like a knife. "God have mercy," she wailed, her words carrying all the pain and desperation of a sister's love. "Please, Lord, show us your mercy." Her cry hung in the air, a last desperate plea for divine intervention. The crowd shifted uneasily, some looking to the sky as if expecting a bolt of lightning or a clap of thunder to answer Eliza's prayer. David stood beneath the noose, his eyes now open and fixed on his sister. Despite the fear etched on his face, there was a glimmer of something else: love, acceptance, perhaps even forgiveness. He managed a small nod as if to say, "It's all right, Eliza. I understand." The mob, momentarily silenced by Eliza's outburst, began to stir once more. Angry voices rose again, calling for the deed to be done. The hunger for blood, momentarily checked, resurged with renewed vigor. "Hang him!" someone shouted from the back of the crowd. "String him up!" The cry was taken up by others, growing in volume until it became a deafening roar. "Hang him! Hang him! Hang him!" The chant pounded through the air like a heartbeat, each repetition driving the crowd closer to frenzy. The marshal's hand trembled, caught between duty and doubt, as the mob howled for blood. In that moment, with David's life hanging quite literally in the balance, the fate of not just one young man, but of an entire community teetered on a knife's edge. Would justice and mercy prevail, or would fear and hatred claim another victim? The chant pounded through the air like a heartbeat, each repetition driving the crowd closer to frenzy. The marshal's hand trembled as he prepared to give the final signal. David closed his eyes, bracing himself for the end. But in that moment of darkest despair, a voice rang out clear and strong above the mob's clamor. "Stop!" The crowd fell silent, heads turning to find the source of the command. From the edge of the gathering, an elderly Cherokee woman stepped forward. Her face was lined with age, but her eyes burned with an intensity that made even the angriest members of the mob take a step back. She moved with slow, deliberate steps, the crowd parting before her like water. In her weathered hands, she clutched a worn leather-bound Bible, holding it high for all to see. "This book," she said, her voice steady and firm, "holds the truth you seek." The marshal lowered his hand, confusion etched across his face. "Ma'am," he began, "I don't see how—" But the old woman cut him off with a sharp gesture. "The rancher," she said, "the one you claim was robbed. He entrusted this to me before he passed." A ripple of murmurs passed through the crowd. The nephew, his face flushed with anger and fear, pushed forward. "What's the meaning of this?" he demanded. "This has nothing to do with—" "Silence," the old woman said, fixing him with a glare that made him stumble back. She turned to face the marshal. "Open it," she commanded, holding out the Bible. With trembling hands, the marshal took the book. He hesitated for a moment, then opened it carefully. As he did, a folded piece of paper slipped from between the pages, fluttering to the ground. Caleb, who had been supporting a trembling Eliza, quickly bent to retrieve it. He unfolded the paper, his eyes widening as he scanned its contents. "It's a letter," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Signed and sealed by the rancher himself." The marshal snatched the paper from Caleb's hands, reading it quickly. As he did, the color drained from his face, shame settling over his features like a heavy blanket. "It's true," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The horses, they were a gift. The boy, David, he's innocent." A collective gasp went up from the crowd. Eyes turned to David, still standing on the gallows with the noose around his neck. The young man's expression was a mixture of disbelief and cautious hope. Reverend Carter, who had been watching the proceedings with growing horror, now stepped forward. His voice, usually so measured and calm, rang out with righteous fervor. "Brothers and sisters," he called, raising his hands to the sky, "we have witnessed a miracle this day. God's truth has come to light, just as we were on the brink of committing a terrible sin." He turned to face the marshal, his eyes blazing with conviction. "Justice demands that this innocent young man be released immediately. We must right this wrong before it's too late." The marshal nodded, shame still evident in every line of his face. He gestured to the deputies, who hurried up the gallows steps to remove the noose from David's neck and cut his bonds. As David was led down from the platform, Eliza broke free from Caleb's steadying grip. She ran to her brother, throwing her arms around him and sobbing uncontrollably. David held her tight, his own tears flowing freely as the reality of his narrow escape sank in. Caleb watched the reunion, his heart swelling with a mixture of relief and something deeper, something he hadn't felt in years. He found himself blinking back tears of his own as he observed the siblings' embrace. The crowd, which had been so eager for blood just moments before, now stood in stunned silence. Some looked ashamed, others confused, and a few appeared angry at having been denied their spectacle. But as the minutes ticked by and the truth of what had nearly happened sank in, a sense of collective guilt began to settle over the gathering. The rancher's nephew, seeing his plans crumble before his eyes, tried to slink away unnoticed, but Caleb's sharp eyes caught the movement. With a growl, he lunged forward, grabbing the man by the collar. "Not so fast," Caleb snarled, his face inches from the nephew's. "You've got some explaining to do." The marshal, shaking off his stupor, nodded in agreement. "Take him into custody," he ordered the deputies. "We'll get to the bottom of this deceit." As the nephew was led away, protesting weakly, Eliza finally released her hold on David. She turned to face the old Cherokee woman who had saved her brother's life. "Thank you," Eliza whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "How can we ever repay you?" The old woman's stern expression softened as she looked at Eliza and David. "There is no debt," she said gently. "I merely did what was right. Your brother's innocence was written in the stars, child. I simply helped others see it." Reverend Carter, who had been watching the proceedings with a mixture of relief and lingering concern, now addressed the crowd once more. "Let this be a lesson to us all," he said, his voice carrying across the now quiet gathering. "We must never let fear or prejudice cloud our judgment. We came so close to committing an unforgivable act today. Only by God's grace were we spared that terrible burden." He paused, looking out over the sea of faces before him. "Let us pray," he said softly, bowing his head. "Let us ask for forgiveness, and for the wisdom to see clearly in the future." As the preacher's words washed over them, many in the crowd bowed their heads in prayer. Others simply stood in silent reflection, contemplating how close they had come to an irreversible tragedy. Caleb made his way back to Eliza and David, his steps slow and measured. As he reached them, Eliza looked up at him, her eyes shining with gratitude and something more, something that made Caleb's heart skip a beat. "You didn't give up on us," she said softly, reaching out to take his hand, "even when all seemed lost." Caleb squeezed her hand gently, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I reckon I've learned a thing or two about faith these past few days," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting its warm light over the scene, the mood in the town square began to shift. The tension that had gripped Alder Creek for days slowly began to dissipate, replaced by a cautious sense of relief and perhaps the first stirrings of redemption. The hidden Bible had revealed the proof that cleared David's name, averting a terrible injustice at the 11th hour. But it had done more than that. It had forced a town to confront its prejudices and fears, opening the door to healing and understanding. As Caleb stood with Eliza and David, watching the crowd slowly disperse, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to hope that perhaps, just perhaps, second chances were possible after all. The mob, once hungry for blood, now dispersed like mist before the morning sun. Shame hung heavy in the air, weighing down shoulders and bowing heads as the townsfolk of Alder Creek shuffled away from the gallows. The truth revealed by the hidden Bible had shattered their certainty, leaving them to grapple with the darkness they had nearly embraced. In the midst of the retreating crowd, the rancher's nephew stood defiant, his face twisted with rage. "This ain't over," he snarled, spittle flying from his lips. "You can't—" His words were cut short as two deputies grabbed him roughly by the arms. The marshal, his own expression a mixture of regret and determination, nodded grimly. "Take him to the jail," he ordered. "We've got a lot of questions that need answering." As the nephew was dragged away, still hurling curses, David Greyhawk swayed on his feet. The noose had been removed from his neck, but the memory of its coarse fibers against his skin lingered. His legs, weak from fear and days of confinement, buckled beneath him. Eliza was there in an instant, her arms wrapping around her brother as he collapsed. "I've got you," she whispered fiercely, tears streaming down her face. "You're safe now. I've got you." David clung to his sister, his body shaking with silent sobs. The weight of what he had nearly lost, his life, his future, his very breath, crashed over him like a tidal wave. Eliza held him tightly, her own tears falling into his dark hair as she murmured soft words of comfort in Cherokee. Caleb Rourke watched the siblings' reunion, his heart swelling with a mixture of relief and something deeper, something he hadn't felt in years. The burden of his past, the guilt he had carried for so long, seemed to lighten just a fraction as he witnessed the power of love and justice prevailing against all odds. Turning, Caleb found himself face to face with Reverend Carter. The preacher's eyes were red-rimmed, his usually neat appearance disheveled from the morning's turmoil. Without a word, Caleb reached out and gripped the man's hand tightly. "Thank you," Caleb said, his voice rough with emotion, "for standing up for what's right, for believing when it would have been easier not to." Reverend Carter returned the grip, a weary smile crossing his face. "It wasn't me," he replied softly. "God's hand was at work here today. We were all just instruments of his will." Caleb nodded, not quite able to embrace the preacher's faith fully, but feeling a newfound respect for the man's conviction. Together, they turned back to where Eliza was helping David to his feet. "Come on," Caleb said gently, moving to support David's other side. "Let's get you both out of here." Slowly, the small group made their way through the now empty streets of Alder Creek. The town seemed hushed, as if holding its breath in the aftermath of the morning's events. A few curtains twitched as they passed, curious and ashamed eyes peering out at the young man who had so nearly been their victim. At the edge of town, where the well-worn dirt of Main Street gave way to the wild grasses of the open prairie, Caleb's faithful mule waited. The animal lifted its head as they approached, ears twitching forward in recognition. "Hey there, old girl," Caleb murmured, patting the mule's neck. "Ready for a trip back home?" With careful movements, they helped David onto the mule's broad back. Eliza climbed up behind him, her arms wrapped protectively around her brother's waist. Caleb took the lead rope, ready to guide them back to the safety of his mountain cabin. As they set out, the sun began its slow descent towards the western horizon. The golden light of dusk painted the landscape in warm hues, softening the harsh edges of the day's events. They traveled in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts as the miles slowly passed beneath their feet. As night fell and stars began to prick the darkening sky, David's soft humming broke the quiet. It was a Cherokee lullaby, one their father had sung to them when they were small. The familiar melody seemed to ease some of the tension from his shoulders, and Eliza found herself joining in, her voice blending with her brother's in perfect harmony. Caleb, leading the mule along the winding mountain trail, felt a deep sense of peace settling over him. The aches of his bruised body, Reminders of the beating he had taken faded into the background as he listened to the siblings' song. It stirred something in him, a longing for connection he had long denied. Behind him, Eliza leaned forward, resting her cheek against David's back. Her eyes, heavy with exhaustion, drifted to Caleb's broad shoulders. In the starlight, she could see the tension that had gripped him for so long beginning to ease. A warmth bloomed in her chest, a feeling of rightness and belonging she had never expected to find. As they climbed higher into the mountains, leaving the troubles of Alder Creek far behind, the little group began to feel the first stirrings of something new. It wasn't just relief at David's narrow escape, though that certainly played a part. It was something deeper, more profound, the sense of found family, of bonds forged in the crucible of shared struggle and triumph. Caleb, his steps sure despite his weariness, led them onward through the night. The path to his cabin was familiar, every twist and turn etched in his memory. But for the first time in years, it didn't feel like a solitary journey. The presence of Eliza and David at his back, their trust in him to guide them safely home, filled a void he hadn't even realized was there. As they rounded the final bend, Caleb's cabin came into view. The sight of its sturdy walls and smoke-blackened chimney, once a symbol of his isolation, now promised shelter and new beginnings for all of them. Pausing at the threshold, Caleb turned to look at his companions. David, still astride the mule, had fallen into an exhausted sleep, his head pillowed on Eliza's shoulder. Eliza met Caleb's gaze, her eyes shining with gratitude and something more, something that made his heart skip a beat. In that moment, as the stars wheeled overhead and the night wind whispered through the pines, Caleb Rourke knew that his life would never be the same. The walls he had built around his heart, meant to protect him from further pain, were crumbling in the face of these two souls who had unexpectedly become so dear to him. With a gentle tug on the mule's lead rope, Caleb guided them the last few steps to the cabin's door. "Welcome home," he said softly, his voice rough with emotion. And as they crossed the threshold together, stepping into the warmth and safety of the cabin, it felt like the beginning of something beautiful. A family forged not by blood, but by choice, by love, and by the unbreakable bonds of shared adversity overcome. The journey back to Caleb's cabin took longer than expected, with frequent stops to rest David's weary body. As noon approached the following day, the small group finally crested the last ridge. The sight of Caleb's rough-hewn shelter nestled against the mountainside brought a collective sigh of relief. Inside, Eliza immediately set to work. Her hands, so long clenched in worry, now moved with purpose as she prepared a simple meal of cornbread and beans. The familiar motions soothed her, and for the first time in weeks she cooked without the shadow of fear hanging over her. David, still weak but eager to help, followed Caleb outside. The older man's gruff kindness had slowly won the boy's trust. Caleb patiently showed David how to mend a torn piece of leather on his saddle, explaining each step with care. Later, they sat on the cabin's porch, Caleb demonstrating the intricate knots needed to repair a fishing line. "You've got steady hands," Caleb remarked, watching David's careful work. The boy's face lit up at the praise, a shy smile spreading across his features. Inside, Eliza moved about the one-room shelter, tidying as she went. She straightened Caleb's few possessions, swept the rough wooden floor, and arranged wildflowers in a tin can on the table. All the while she hummed softly, an old Cherokee melody her father had taught her. As evening approached, snow began to fall gently outside. The three gathered around the fireplace, its warm glow casting dancing shadows on the walls. David recounted a funny story from his time with the horses, his voice growing animated. Eliza's laughter, clear and bright, filled the cabin. Even Caleb found himself chuckling, the sound rusty from disuse but genuine. Caleb sat back in his chair, watching Eliza and David. The siblings' easy banter and shared smiles stirred something deep within him. He realized, with a mixture of surprise and contentment, that he had begun to love not just Eliza, but the idea of a family once more. The loneliness that had been his constant companion for so many years seemed to retreat in the face of their presence. As the fire crackled and the snow continued to fall outside, a new sense of home and belonging began to blossom among the three. The cabin, once a refuge for a solitary man, now felt alive with possibility. Later that evening, the cabin grew quiet as the fire crackled softly in the hearth. David, exhausted from the day's events, had curled up on a blanket near the warmth of the flames. His steady breathing filled the room, a peaceful counterpoint to the gentle snowfall outside. Eliza sat beside Caleb on the rough-hewn bench, their shoulders nearly touching. The flickering light cast shadows across their faces, highlighting the weariness etched into their features. Yet beneath the fatigue, a newfound sense of peace lingered. Eliza's fingers twisted nervously in her lap as she turned to face Caleb. Her voice, barely above a whisper, trembled with vulnerability. "Please, don't look at my back," she murmured, echoing the words she had spoken when they first met. Caleb's eyes glistened with unshed tears as he gazed at her. His weathered face softened, compassion etching deep lines around his eyes. "Eliza," he replied, his voice low and gentle. "I already see your scars, but I see your strength more, and it makes you beautiful." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Eliza's breath caught in her throat as the full weight of Caleb's acceptance washed over her. Years of shame and self-loathing that she had carried like a physical burden suddenly felt too much to bear. A sob escaped her lips, and then another. The floodgates opened, and Eliza wept openly, her shoulders shaking with the force of her released emotions. All the pain, all the fear, all the loneliness she had endured came pouring out in a torrent of tears. Caleb didn't hesitate. He wrapped his arms around her, drawing her close against his chest. His embrace was gentle yet firm, a silent promise of protection and understanding. As Eliza cried, Caleb held her, his own tears falling silently into her hair. "The past does not define your future," Caleb whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "You are so much more than what was done to you. You are strong, Eliza. You are brave. And you are loved." In that moment, something shifted between them. The bond that had been growing since that snowy day by the stream deepened, transforming into something profound. It was a love born of shared pain and mutual healing, a connection that went beyond mere attraction. As Eliza's sobs gradually subsided, she remained in Caleb's arms, drawing comfort from his steady presence. They sat together in the firelight, two souls finding solace in each other, their hearts beating as one. As winter's icy grip loosened its hold on the mountain, the first signs of spring began to emerge. Tender green shoots poked through the softening earth, and the air carried the promise of warmer days to come. Weeks had passed since that night by the fire when Caleb and Eliza had shared their deepest hurts and found healing in each other's arms. The small clearing around Caleb's cabin buzzed with activity as the trio worked together to prepare the garden plot. Caleb's strong hands guided the plow, turning over rich, dark soil that had lain dormant through the long winter. Eliza followed behind, her fingers working deftly to break up clumps of earth, while David darted back and forth, clearing away stones and debris. "Reckon these beans'll grow tall and strong," Caleb said, pausing to wipe sweat from his brow. He glanced at Eliza, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Just like this family we're building." Eliza's cheeks flushed with pleasure at his words. She looked over at David, who was carefully placing bean seeds into neat rows. The boy's face had filled out over the past weeks, nourished by regular meals and the warmth of belonging. "We've all done some growing," she said softly. As the afternoon sun began its descent, the sound of hoofbeats drew their attention. Reverend Josiah Carter appeared on the path, his horse laden with bulging saddlebags. The young preacher dismounted with a broad smile, his eyes taking in the scene before him. "Well now, this is a sight to warm the heart," he said, approaching the garden. "Looks like you folks have been busy as bees." Caleb stepped forward, extending a hand in greeting. "Much obliged for the visit, Reverend. What brings you up the mountain?" Reverend Carter patted one of the saddlebags. "Thought you might appreciate some supplies from town. Flour, coffee, and such. And," he added with a twinkle in his eye, "I wanted to see how this little flock was faring." They gathered around as the preacher unpacked his offerings, exclaiming over the thoughtful additions: a small sack of peppermint candy for David, a bolt of cheerful calico fabric for Eliza. As Caleb stowed the goods inside the cabin, Reverend Carter's gaze swept over the homestead. The Lord works in mysterious ways, he mused. Out of sorrow and struggle, he brings new life and hope. The preacher placed a hand on Caleb's shoulder. Remember, my friend, God redeems the brokenhearted. He's given you a second chance at family. Don't let fear hold you back from embracing it fully. Caleb nodded, his throat tight with emotion. You speak true, Reverend. I aim to do right by them. As twilight deepened the shadows around them, Reverend Carter prepared to depart. He raised his hands in blessing over the little group. May the Lord bless you and keep you, he intoned. May his face shine upon you and give you peace. After the preacher had ridden away, a hush fell over the clearing. The first stars winked to life in the deepening blue of the sky. Caleb took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he knew he must do. He turned to Eliza, reaching for her hand. His fingers, calloused from years of hard work, were gentle as they enfolded hers. Eliza, he said, his voice low and earnest, I know we ain't known each other long in the counting of days, but in my heart it feels like I've been waiting for you my whole life. He swallowed hard, pushing past the lump in his throat. Would you stay? Share this cabin, this life with me? Be my partner in all things? Eliza's eyes widened, filling with tears. She looked at David, who nodded encouragingly, then back to Caleb. A smile brighter than the rising moon spread across her face as she nodded, unable to speak past the joyful tears. Caleb drew her close, his own eyes damp. Then, surprising them all, he bowed his head. Lord, he began, his voice rough with emotion. It's been a long time since I spoke to you proper, but I'm asking now, bless this family you've given us. Help us to love each other well, to heal each other's hurts. Thank you for this new beginning. As Caleb's prayer faded into the gathering night, the three stood together, arms linked, their hearts full of hope for the future. The scars they carried, once sources of shame and sorrow, now stood as testaments to their strength and the redemptive power of love. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.